Hello, friend. Welcome to Science for Sleep. Whether you have returned tonight or are finding this channel for the first time, this is a quiet place to slow down, learn something gentle, and allow the day to gradually fall away. Tonight, we are spending some time with the potato. A potato can sit in a kitchen cupboard without attracting much attention. It may be boiled and mashed until soft, baked until its skin turns crisp, sliced into chips, or cut into long golden fries. It can be folded into Polish pierogi, shaped into Italian gnocchi, grated into Swiss rösti, mixed into Irish colcannon, fried as latkes, cooked into Indian aloo dishes, or covered with cheese curds and gravy in Canadian poutine. In the high Andes, potatoes are still preserved as chuño, a light, dry food made through freezing, pressing, and drying. These foods may look completely different, yet they all begin with the same basic structure, a swollen piece of plant tissue formed beneath the soil. That underground food is now grown in well over 100 countries. More than 1 billion people eat potatoes regularly, and farms produce several 100 million metric tons in a typical year. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, you're welcome to subscribe. And if it feels natural, to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. It helps others find this calm corner of science, one sleepy listener at a time. Its exact place among the world's major crops depends on what is measured. A ranking based on total weight may differ from one based on calories, harvested land, or the amount eaten directly by people. But under almost any useful measure, the potato remains one of humanity's major foods. Its history began far from modern farms and grocery stores. Its ancestors grew high in the Andes Mountains of South America, especially around present-day Peru and Bolivia. Indigenous farmers began domesticating potatoes roughly 8,000 years ago. Generation after generation, they selected plants that produced useful tubers in cold, thin soils at elevations where frost could arrive during almost any month. Over time, they developed thousands of varieties. Some were yellow or red. Others were purple, blue, cream, or almost black. They differed in shape, taste, growing time, and frost tolerance. This diversity supported Andean communities and later became part of the food system of the Inca Empire. During the 16th century, Spanish ships carried potatoes across the Atlantic. Europe did not accept them quickly. The plant was unfamiliar, belonged to the same family as several poisonous species, and formed its edible part underground, rather than in a visible head of grain. Yet the potato offered something that became difficult to ignore. Under suitable conditions, a small piece of land could produce a heavy harvest of edible tubers. Those tubers could be cooked without a mill, grown in cool regions where some grain struggled, and used by families with little land. As potatoes spread through Europe, they helped support rising populations, crowded towns, soldiers, laborers, and farming households. In Ireland, the crop became especially important to poor tenant families living on small plots. Its yield allowed many people to survive, but that success also encouraged a dangerous level of dependence. When late blight reached Ireland in 1845, the organism attacked the leaves and tubers of vulnerable potato plants. Repeated crop failures followed: hunger, disease, eviction, and inadequate relief turned a plant epidemic into one of the 19th century's worst humanitarian disasters. Roughly 1 million people died, while about another million left Ireland during the Central Famine years. Many traveled to Britain, Canada, the United States, and other parts of the world, carrying family memories and food traditions with them. The potato, therefore, belongs to more than agricultural history. It is connected with population growth, poverty, migration, industry, cooking, family ancestry, and the risks of relying too heavily on one crop. Its influence came from an unusual combination of traits. It could turn sunlight into a dense store of starch, place that reserve below the surface, and use it to begin another generation. Before following the potato across empires, famines, kitchens, factories, and modern laboratories, it helps to look closely at that hidden structure. Because the object we call a potato is not actually a root. It is something more surprising, a living underground stem. Although it grows beneath the soil, the potato belongs to the stem system of the plant. Botanists call this swollen structure a tuber. A tuber is a thickened part of an underground stem that stores water and food for later growth. The cultivated potato is generally known by the scientific name Solanum tuberosum. It belongs to a plant family called Solanaceae, usually known as the nightshade family. Tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants are members of this same family. Their flowers often share a similar shape, even though the foods they produce look very different. The potato plant begins forming tubers on slender underground stems called stolons. A stolon grows outward beneath the soil from the lower part of the main plant. Its tip begins small and narrow. Under suitable conditions, that tip stops growing longer and starts growing wider. Water, sugars, and other materials enter the tissue. Over time, the tip swells into the structure that will eventually be lifted from the soil as a potato. The shallow marks scattered across its skin are known as eyes. Each eye is a cluster containing one or more buds. These buds are living points of growth. A potato left in a warm cupboard may begin producing pale shoots from its eyes. Those shoots often stretch toward any available light. They use energy stored inside the tuber before the new plant has leaves of its own. When a seed potato is placed in soil, one of these shoots can grow upward. A stem eventually breaks through the surface and begins producing green leaves. Roots grow downward from the lower stem and spread into the surrounding soil. They absorb water along with dissolved minerals such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The original seed potato may slowly soften and shrink as its stored energy is used. Above the soil, the young plant develops branching stems covered with broad, divided leaves. A healthy potato plant commonly grows between about 40 and 100 centimeters tall, depending on its variety and growing conditions. Once the leaves are exposed to sunlight, they begin producing sugars through photosynthesis. Those sugars help build new tissue and later supply the underground tubers. A mature potato plant may also produce flowers. The flowers can be white, pink, blue, or purple. Many have 5 pointed petals surrounding a yellow center. Their shape makes the potato's relationship with tomatoes and other nightshade plants easier to recognize. Some potato plants are able to form small green fruits after their flowers are pollinated. These fruits can resemble firm cherry tomatoes. They contain true botanical seeds, with each seed carrying a new mixture of genes. They are not edible potatoes. Potato fruits can contain substantial amounts of glycoalkaloids, which are bitter defensive chemicals made by the plant. The leaves and stems also contain these compounds. Higher amounts may be found in sprouts and in tubers exposed to enough light to turn green. The normal flesh of a sound, properly stored potato usually contains much lower levels. These chemicals help defend the plant against insects and other animals that may try to eat it. The tuber beneath the skin remains active even after harvest. Its cells continue using oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide through respiration. Respiration is the slow process by which living cells release usable energy from stored food. A potato can also seal small cuts by forming protective tissue over an injured area. This wound healing ability helps reduce water loss and limits entry points for some microorganisms. As weeks or months pass, the tuber continues aging. Its stored starch may gradually change. Water slowly escapes. Dormant buds become more ready to sprout. Temperature strongly affects the speed of these changes. Cold storage can slow respiration and sprouting, although temperatures that are too low may cause some starch to change into sugars. Warm conditions usually speed up aging. Light can trigger greening and alter the tuber's chemistry. Even on a shelf or inside a storage building, the potato continues responding to its surroundings. Inside that quiet structure are stored water, starch-filled cells, protective chemicals, and buds waiting for the right season. The tuber carries enough energy to support a new shoot until green leaves can begin collecting light. Once those leaves are working, the flow reverses. Energy captured in the open air begins traveling downward, toward the hidden stems where another crop of potatoes will slowly take shape. A seed potato begins the growing season with energy already stored inside it. Farmers may plant a whole tuber or cut a larger one into pieces, as long as each piece carries at least one healthy eye. That eye contains a living bud. Once the soil warms and moisture reaches the tuber, the bud begins extending into a shoot. During these first days, the young plant depends on starch stored inside the seed potato. Its new leaves are still folded, and no sunlight has reached them yet. Enzymes inside the tuber break some of the stored starch into smaller sugars. Those sugars provide energy for cell division, stem growth, and the first roots. As the shoot rises, roots spread through the surrounding soil. Fine root hairs absorb water along with dissolved minerals. Nitrogen helps the plant build proteins and green leaf tissue. Phosphorus supports energy transfer inside cells. Potassium helps regulate water movement and many of the reactions involved in growth. The shoot eventually reaches the surface and opens its leaves to the light. Photosynthesis can now begin. Inside the leaves are tiny structures called chloroplasts, which contain the green pigment chlorophyll. Chlorophyll absorbs light energy. The plant uses that energy to combine carbon dioxide from the air with water carried upward from the roots. The result is a supply of energy-rich sugars. Some of those sugars remain in the leaves and support their daily activity. Others travel to growing stems, roots, flowers, and underground tissue. Their transport system is called the phloem. Phloem is a network of living tubes that carries dissolved sugars from parts of the plant producing food toward parts that need or store it. Below the surface, slender stems called stolons begin growing sideways from the lower portion of the plant. They may extend several centimeters through the soil before their tips change direction. At first, a stolon behaves like an ordinary stem, adding new cells and growing longer. Then its tip can begin a major change called tuber initiation. Growth in length slows. cells at the tip divide and expand in several directions. The narrow stolon gradually develops a rounded swelling. Sugars arriving through the phloem enter these growing cells. Much of that sugar is converted into starch, a form that allows the plant to pack a large amount of stored energy into a small space. Potato starch contains two main kinds of molecules. Amylose is built mostly from long, straighter chains of glucose. Amylopectin has a heavily branched structure. Together, they gather inside microscopic starch granules that fill many of the tuber's cells. Tuber initiation depends on several conditions working together. Each potato variety carries inherited instructions that affect when swelling begins. Plant hormones act as chemical signals between tissues. Day length also matters because potato ancestors developed under particular seasonal patterns. Many traditional Andean varieties begin forming tubers most readily under shorter days. Varieties selected over centuries in northern Europe became better suited to the long summer days found far from the equator. Temperature can strongly alter the process. Moderately cool conditions usually support tuber formation and steady bulking. When soil and air remain excessively hot, plants may produce fewer tubers or send more energy into leaves and stems. Heat can also slow the movement of carbohydrates into the developing crop. Water supply has a similar influence. A steady supply supports the expansion of thousands of water-filled cells. Dry periods during tuber development may reduce final size. Uneven watering can contribute to unusual shapes, growth cracks, or secondary swellings. Too much nitrogen may keep the upper plant growing vigorously, while delaying the movement of energy into tubers. Once tuber bulking is underway, each swelling increases in weight as starch and water accumulate. Several potatoes may develop along the stolons of one plant. Their number and size depend on variety, weather, soil, planting distance, and the health of the leaves above. Near the end of the season, the plant begins to mature. Leaves yellow as their ability to photosynthesize declines. The tuber skin thickens and becomes more firmly attached. A period of dormancy follows, allowing the harvested potato to remain quiet before its buds begin growing again. Across an entire field, this process unfolds mostly out of sight. Leaves gather light in the open air, while sugars move downward through living tissue. Beneath the surface, those sugars become compact stores of starch capable of feeding people or supporting another generation of plants. This ability became especially valuable in a cold, elevated landscape where ordinary farming faced frost, thin soil, and sudden changes in weather. The first farmers to shape the potato lived in the central Andes of South America. This long mountain chain rises through present-day Peru and Bolivia, where high plateaus sit between steep ridges and deep valleys. Near the border of those two countries lies Lake Titicaca. Its surface rests about 3,812 meters above sea level. The broad country around it is known as the Altiplano, a Spanish word meaning high plain. Potato domestication is generally traced to this region around 8,000 years ago. The people who began that work lived there thousands of years before the Inca Empire appeared during the 15th century. Their farms occupied an environment that could change quickly. Sunlight is intense at high elevation because the atmosphere is thinner and blocks less ultraviolet radiation. Days may feel warm beneath a clear sky, while temperatures fall below freezing after sunset. A hard frost can injure leaves in a single night. Strong rain may wash soil from a slope, and dry periods can slow the growth of a crop that needs steady water, while its tubers are swelling. The growing season is also short. At elevations around 3,500 meters, farmers must fit planting, flowering, and tuber growth between periods of damaging cold. Some Andean potato varieties are cultivated above 4,000 meters, where few major food crops remain dependable. Wild potato relatives were already growing across parts of this mountain landscape. Their tubers were usually smaller than the potatoes found in a modern market. Many also had a bitter taste, caused partly by glycoalkaloids. These are defensive chemicals that can discourage insects and grazing animals. At high levels, they can also make a tuber unsafe for people to eat. Early Andean farmers could not see genes or measure chemical compounds. They could still notice which plants produced larger tubers, which tasted less bitter, and which survived frost more successfully. Useful tubers were saved for planting. Families exchanged seed potatoes with neighbors or carried them between settlements. Plants that performed well had a greater chance of producing the following year's crop. This repeated choice is the basic process of domestication. Every planted tuber carries inherited instructions from the plant that produced it. When farmers keep choosing plants with certain traits, those traits become more common over many generations. The changes extend far beyond size. Selection altered the amount of defensive chemicals inside the tubers. It affected how long a harvested potato remained dormant before sprouting. Different plants began maturing at different speeds, allowing some crops to finish during short mountain summers. Other varieties produced reliable yields in particular soils, or at elevations where cold arrived often. A potato that succeeded beside Lake Titicaca might behave differently when planted several hundred meters higher. Conditions could also change across a short horizontal distance. One slope might receive strong morning sun, while another remained shaded and damp. A sheltered hollow could hold cold air overnight. Raised fields near wet ground offered a different growing environment from stone terraces cut into a hillside. Generations of farmers learned these small differences through direct experience. They matched particular potatoes with particular fields and protected the varieties that continued producing food. By the time the Inca state expanded across the Andes during the 1400s, potato agriculture was already ancient. The Inca inherited a deep body of knowledge developed by earlier cultures and local communities. Their administration helped move crops and stored food across a large territory, while the agricultural foundation beneath that system had been built through many centuries of farming. The useful potato therefore emerged through a long partnership between plants and people. Mountain conditions supplied the pressure. Human selection guided which plants continued. The result was a crop able to grow across an unusually difficult landscape. Across the Andes, that long work produced thousands of distinct forms, each carrying a different set of answers to cold, altitude, soil, pests, and the needs of the people who grew it. Across the Andes, a potato field may change within the distance of a short walk. One slope receives strong afternoon sun, while another remains cool beneath passing cloud. A sheltered hollow may collect frost during the night. Higher ground may drain quickly after rain, while darker soil near a wet meadow holds moisture for much longer. These differences occur across valleys, plateaus, terraces, and mountainsides stretching through Peru, Bolivia, and neighboring regions. Over many generations, Andean farmers matched particular potatoes with these particular places. The result is a living collection of more than 4,000 native potato varieties. A modern supermarket may offer only a few familiar types. An Andean market can display tubers that barely resemble one another. Some are round and smooth. Others are long, flattened, tightly curved, or covered with deep knobs. Their eyes may rest close to the surface or sink into narrow hollows. A few varieties produce tubers small enough to fit several in one hand. Others grow much larger when soil, temperature, and rainfall are favorable. The colors extend far beyond ordinary brown skin and white flesh. Native potatoes may be cream, yellow, red, pink, blue, or deep purple. Some contain 2 or more colors in rings, patches, or streaks. Blue and purple potatoes receive much of their color from pigments called anthocyanins. These are the same broad group of pigments found in blueberries, blackberries, and red cabbage. Yellow flesh potatoes often contain more carotenoids. The family of yellow and orange pigments also found in foods such as carrots and squash. The visible differences are only part of the diversity. Each variety carries inherited traits that affect how it grows and how people use it. One may tolerate frost more successfully than its neighbor. Another may continue producing during a dry period or resist damage from a local insect. Some mature early enough to escape cold weather near the end of the growing season. Others take longer, but produce a heavier harvest when conditions remain stable. Texture also varies. Certain potatoes become soft and floury after cooking. Others remain firm in soups or stews. Some have a mild flavor, while native bitter potatoes may require special preparation before they are eaten. Many of these locally adapted populations are known as landraces. A landrace is a crop population maintained by farmers over generations within a particular region. It has enough shared features to be recognized by name, yet it usually contains more genetic variation than a highly uniform commercial variety. That variation continues changing as farmers select tubers, exchange planting material, and respond to new weather or pests. A single family may plant several potato varieties in the same season. They may place one type in a warmer field and another at higher elevation. Early and late varieties can be harvested at different times. This spreads the risk across different plants and different weeks of weather. A short frost may damage the variety flowering at that moment, while sparing another that has already formed mature tubers. A dry month may reduce one harvest more severely than the rest. Disease may move quickly through a susceptible variety, while neighboring plants carry stronger inherited defenses. Genetic diversity works much like a collection of separate safety nets. Each variety has its own weaknesses, but those weaknesses do not always appear under the same conditions. This makes a mixed harvest more dependable than a field in which every plant responds in nearly the same way. Scientists now preserve part of this diversity in controlled collections. The International Potato Center, based in Lima, Peru, maintains thousands of cultivated and wild potato accessions. An accession is a stored sample of a distinct plant population, variety, or wild relative, kept for study and future breeding. Some are maintained as living plant tissue in laboratory containers. Others are conserved as seeds or grown in field collections. Storage in a gene bank protects valuable material from being lost. Continued cultivation on Andean farms remains equally important. A variety growing in its home region continues interacting with local soil, climate, insects, diseases, cooking traditions, and farmer choices. Its place in a community may include a name, a preferred dish, a planting date, or a role in a seasonal celebration. The original strength of potato agriculture came from this wide family of forms rather than one perfect tuber. Diversity helped communities bring food from difficult ground, despite frost, uneven rain, and changing seasons. A successful harvest still arrived with a limit. Fresh potatoes contain a great deal of water, remain biologically active, and eventually sprout or decay. Andean farmers found a way to make the cold mountain air preserve the food that the mountain soil had produced. Once potatoes were lifted from the soil, their useful life began to shorten. A fresh tuber is roughly 4/5 water. Its cells remain alive after harvest, using stored sugars through respiration and slowly releasing heat, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. Given enough time, buds begin to sprout. Molds and bacteria can enter through cuts or damaged skin, while moist tissue gives them the water needed to multiply. Andean communities developed a preservation method that used the cold, dry conditions of the high mountains. The preserved potato became known as chuño. Versions of this food were being made long before the rise of the Inca Empire, drawing on knowledge developed across generations of indigenous farming communities. Traditional production usually begins during the dry season, when nights on the Altiplano are cold and skies are often clear. At elevations near 4,000 meters, temperatures can fall below freezing after sunset, even when the daytime sun feels warm. Freshly harvested potatoes are spread across flat ground and left outdoors overnight. Water inside their cells freezes and expands. This damages the thin walls and membranes that normally hold each cell together. During the following day, sunlight warms the frozen tubers and allows them to thaw. Their softened tissue now releases water much more easily than a fresh potato would. Families may press the tubers by hand or tread across them carefully with bare feet. Pressure forces liquid from the damaged cells and may loosen the skins. The potatoes are then exposed to more cold nights and dry days. Each freezing and thawing cycle breaks down more tissue. Continued pressing removes additional moisture, while sunlight and dry mountain air slowly carry water away. Microorganisms need available water to grow. As moisture falls, bacterial activity slows, and mold has greater difficulty spreading through the food. The tuber becomes smaller, harder, and much lighter than it was at harvest. Dark chuño often develops a grey, brown, or nearly black surface. Its color comes from changes inside the damaged potato tissue during freezing, drying, and exposure to air. A lighter product is commonly called tunta, moraya, or white chuño, depending on the region and local method. These potatoes usually pass through extra washing or soaking stages. In some communities, frozen tubers are kept in cold running water for days or weeks before they are dried. Water carries away some pigments, bitter compounds, and material released from the broken cells. The finished tunta may appear pale cream or chalky white. Both forms can remain firm and dry in storage for years when protected from moisture. Before cooking, chuño can be soaked to help it absorb water again. It may then be simmered in soups, stews, or porridges alongside maize, beans, meat, or local herbs. Its texture and flavor differ from those of a freshly boiled potato, yet its long storage life gives it a special value. A family could preserve part of a good harvest for a later season. Stored chuño offered support when frost damaged a future crop or when rainfall arrived at the wrong time. Its low weight also made it easier to carry across mountain routes. Food produced in cold highland fields could move toward warmer valleys, where maize, peppers, and other crops were grown. These exchanges connected communities living at different elevations. Larger Andean states later collected preserved foods as tribute and stored supplies for workers, travelers, and armies. The Inca expanded these systems across a vast territory during the 1400s and early 1500s. Their storehouses held food suited to long storage, including dried maize and preserved potatoes. The knowledge behind chuño was already ancient by that time. It had grown from close attention to frost, sunlight, moisture, and the behavior of potato tissue. Cold weather remained a threat to crops still growing in the field. After harvest, the same cold became part of an effective preservation process. By the 16th century, Andean farmers possessed thousands of potato varieties and methods for keeping part of the harvest usable far beyond its normal season. European ships would soon carry the plant across the Atlantic. The agricultural knowledge surrounding it traveled far less completely. During the 1530s, Spanish forces entered the Inca realm and began taking control of cities, mines, farmland, and trade routes across the Andes. Ships soon carried American plants eastward across the Atlantic. Maize, tomatoes, cacao, peppers, and potatoes entered Europe through this widening exchange. In the opposite direction came wheat, horses, cattle, and diseases that caused devastating losses among indigenous populations. Historians call this movement the Columbian Exchange. The name describes the large transfer of living organisms between the Americas and the rest of the world after European voyages began connecting the continents. Potatoes entered this system quietly. No single ship, captain, or date can be identified as the one confirmed beginning of their European journey. Spanish sailors, officials, merchants, and religious communities probably carried tubers through several routes during the second half of the 16th century. A shipping record from November of 1567 shows potatoes being transported from Gran Canaria to Antwerp. This tells us that the crop had already reached the Canary Islands by the 1560s. Located in the Atlantic west of Morocco, the islands served as an important stopping point between Spain and the Americas. Their mild climate also offered a useful place for testing unfamiliar crops. Potatoes later appeared in records from mainland Spain and other parts of Europe. Some were grown in private gardens as rare plants from overseas. Botanists studied their leaves and flowers. Monasteries and hospitals sometimes cultivated them as inexpensive food for the people under their care. Small numbers of tubers passed between gardeners, scholars, merchants, and landowners. Several routes carried the crop northward, which makes the popular story of one famous introduction difficult to support. Sir Walter Raleigh is often credited with bringing the potato to Ireland during the 1580s. Clear evidence for that claim is lacking. Potatoes may have reached Ireland from Spain, England, or through several connected trade networks. Their spread was gradual enough that many early movements left little written record. Physical arrival solved only the first part of the problem. A potato adapted to the Andes did not always behave well during a European summer. Near the equator, the length of daylight changes relatively little across the year. Many traditional Andean potatoes respond to shorter days by beginning tuber formation. Farther north, summer daylight can continue for 16 hours or more. A plant sensitive to short days may spend much of the European summer producing leaves and stems. Tuber growth can begin too late, leaving the underground crop small when autumn frost arrives. Farmers did not need to understand hormones or genes to notice this difference. Plants that formed useful tubers earlier were more likely to be harvested and replanted. Through repeated selection, European growers gradually favored potatoes able to begin swelling under longer days. This process took place across generations of plants and in many separate farming regions. New introductions also added useful genetic material. Evidence from potato DNA suggests that early European stocks were connected strongly with Andean potatoes. Later arrivals from the lowlands of southern Chile contributed to the ancestry of many modern European varieties. Chilean potatoes were already adapted to longer summer days at southern latitudes. Their inherited timing helped plants form tubers under conditions found in northern Europe. Reliable planting material also mattered. A sound tuber had to survive the voyage without rotting. Once planted, it required loose soil, enough moisture, and protection from severe frost. Farmers needed to learn when to place it in the ground and how deeply to cover the developing tubers. Exposure to sunlight could turn them green, while poor drainage encouraged decay. Useful cultivation knowledge developed slowly through local trial and repeated harvests. By the end of the 16th century, the potato had established small footholds in several parts of Europe. Its flowers could be admired in a garden, and its tubers could be produced under the right conditions. Widespread acceptance remained distant. European societies already depended on grain fields, flour mills, bread ovens, and familiar ideas about which plants were safe to eat. The potato had crossed an ocean and adjusted to longer days. It still carried the appearance of a strange nightshade plant, whose most valuable part remained hidden in the dirt. Across Europe, familiar food came from fields of grain. Wheat grew across warmer and more fertile regions. Rye tolerated colder climates and poorer soils. Barley and oats supported people, livestock, and brewing. These crops were woven into far more than daily meals. Landlords collected rent in grain. Governments taxed harvests and controlled markets. Villages depended on watermills or windmills to turn kernels into flour. Large ovens baked bread for households that did not own ovens of their own. Churches used bread in religious ceremonies, and ordinary families often judged the security of a year by the amount of grain stored after harvest. Producing bread required a long chain of work. Farmers cut the mature stalks and gathered them into bundles. Threshing separated the grain from the plant. Winnowing used moving air to carry away the lighter chaff. The cleaned kernels then had to be stored, milled, mixed into dough, and baked. An entire network of tools, workers, buildings, and customs had grown around this process. The potato entered that world as a deeply unfamiliar plant. Its flowers could look attractive in a private garden, yet its food remained hidden beneath the soil. People could inspect a head of grain and watch it ripen in the sun. A potato harvest offered fewer visible signs until the plants were lifted from the ground. Its lumpy tubers also carried small buds that looked like eyes. The plant belonged to the nightshade family, which included several species already known for poisonous leaves or berries. This connection gave people a real reason for caution. Potato leaves, stems, fruits, and sprouts can contain elevated amounts of glycoalkaloids. These bitter defensive chemicals help protect the plant from insects and grazing animals. Tubers exposed to light may turn green and can also develop higher concentrations of the same compounds. Early growers did not understand the chemistry, but unpleasant reactions from eating green tubers, sprouts, or the small fruits could make the entire plant seem unsafe. Preparation knowledge also mattered. A community encountering potatoes for the first time might cook an unsuitable part of the plant or store the tubers in bright light. One bad experience could shape local opinion for years. The flowers were easier to appreciate. Botanical gardens displayed potato plants among other unusual species brought from the Americas. Wealthy landowners sometimes grew them as curiosities. Naturalists drew their leaves and blossoms while debating how the new plant should be classified and used. Regular consumption developed much more slowly. Potatoes were sometimes supplied to hospitals, charitable institutions, military stores, or communities facing food shortages. These uses proved that the crop could feed people, but they also linked it with illness, poverty, and emergency relief. A food associated with desperation rarely gained prestige quickly. Medical writers expressed mixed opinions. Some believed potatoes were difficult to digest or unsuitable for certain bodies. Others gradually recognized their value as a practical source of nourishment. The surviving record differs from one country to another, so later stories about universal bans and widespread religious rejection often make European resistance appear more uniform than it really was. Some farmers adopted potatoes early. Other communities kept them mainly for animals or garden display. Local climate, soil, food customs, and previous experience all shaped the response. Trust grew through repeated harvests. Families learned which parts were edible, how deeply to plant the tubers, and how to keep them away from light. They discovered how potatoes behaved in soups, stews, and simple boiled meals. Acceptance remained slow while grain harvests were dependable and enough land was available. War altered that balance. Failed harvests raised the price of bread. Growing populations placed more pressure on farmland. A crop, once judged by its strange appearance, began to be judged by the weight of food it could produce from a small field. The potato became more persuasive when farmers compared the food leaving each field. A grain harvest produced wheat, rye, barley, or oats at the tops of long stalks. Those stalks had to be cut and gathered before the edible kernels could be separated. Threshing loosened the grain from the dry plant. Winnowing used moving air to remove lighter husks and chaff. The cleaned grain still required storage, milling, and cooking before it became bread or porridge. Much of the material carried from a grain field never entered the human diet. Straw remained useful for animal bedding, roofing, fuel, and livestock feed, but it did not become flour. A potato harvest was physically different. Most of the weight lifted from beneath the soil consisted of tubers that could be eaten after damaged, green, or rotten portions were removed. They did not need to be threshed or passed through a mill. A household could place them directly into boiling water, hot ashes, an oven, or a cooking pot. This reduced the distance between harvesting food and eating it. The potato also concentrated a large harvest into a relatively small area. Yields vary greatly with soil, rainfall, variety, disease, and farming methods. Under suitable modern conditions, 1 hectare can produce tens of metric tons of tubers. Historical harvests were usually much smaller, yet potatoes could still provide more edible food from certain cool, moist plots than the grain crops available to the same farmers. That advantage mattered most where families had little land. A household did not need a large field, a team of horses, or access to a flour mill before it could begin growing potatoes. Seed tubers could be placed in rows using hand tools. Soil was drawn around the developing plants with a hoe or spade. At harvest, the tubers could be lifted from the ground and carried home in baskets or sacks. Growing time also offered flexibility. Some early potato varieties can mature in roughly 70 to 90 days. Main crop varieties may remain in the ground for around 120 days or longer. The exact season depends on temperature and daylight, but potatoes can complete their growth more quickly than some traditional grain systems. This allowed farmers to fit them into short northern summers or use them between other crops. Cool weather often supported steady tuber growth. Potatoes could also produce food in soils where wheat performed poorly, although they still needed enough loose earth, water, and nutrients to form a good crop. Their underground position offered limited protection. Wind could flatten grain stalks while the tubers remained below the surface. Passing soldiers might overlook a field after the upper plants had died back. Fire could destroy exposed crops more quickly than food buried in the soil. That protection had clear limits. Armies could dig potatoes once they recognized the field. Flooding could suffocate roots or spread rot. Frost could kill leaves before the tubers matured. Late blight would eventually show that an underground harvest could still be destroyed by disease. Potatoes also carried disadvantages that grain did not. A fresh potato contains roughly 75 to 80% water. That water makes the crop heavy to transport. It also keeps the tuber alive and vulnerable to sprouting, bruising, and decay. Dry grain can remain stable for long periods when protected from moisture and pests. It packs more calories into each kilogram and can travel long distances more easily. Bread economies therefore remain valuable for trade, taxation, armies, and cities. Potatoes worked especially well as a local food. Their greatest advantage appeared where land was scarce. Growing conditions were cool, and people lived close enough to consume the heavy harvest. In those places, the important measurement was often the number of meals a field could provide. A small plot producing a dense crop of tubers could support a family through months when bread was expensive. Several such fields could support more workers, children, and elderly relatives within the same landscape. The potato gradually became an answer to a recurring problem of European life. Growing populations were pressing against limited supplies of affordable food. Once rulers and agricultural reformers understood that calculation, planting potatoes became connected with national food security, military planning, and deliberate campaigns to change what people grew. By the 18th century, European rulers were paying closer attention to crops that could protect their populations during war and poor harvests. Grain remained essential, yet its supply could fail for several reasons. Armies burned fields, mills were damaged, transport routes closed, and bread prices rose quickly when harvests were weak. A crop that produced heavy yields on small plots offered governments a practical form of food security. Prussia became one of the best-known examples. Frederick II ruled Prussia from 1740 until 1786. He is often remembered as Frederick the Great. His kingdom fought several major conflicts during his reign, including the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763. Feeding soldiers and civilians during repeated warfare required more than military planning. It required crops that could survive difficult seasons and make efficient use of limited farmland. Prussian authorities issued several orders encouraging potato cultivation. The most famous is often called the Potato Order of 1756. Officials were expected to explain how potatoes should be planted and to encourage local communities to grow them. The government saw the tuber as a useful reserve when grain was scarce. Frederick's role later became surrounded by a popular story. According to the legend, he planted potatoes in a royal field and placed soldiers around it. The guards were supposedly instructed to protect the crop poorly, allowing villagers to steal valuable tubers and plant them at home. The story presents Frederick as a clever ruler who used curiosity and status to overcome resistance. Its historical details remain uncertain. Potatoes were already being cultivated in parts of the German-speaking world before Frederick's campaigns, and adoption varied widely between regions. His government still helped make the crop more visible. Official pressure encouraged experiments on farms where potatoes had previously received little attention. Military demand and periods of high grain prices added further motivation. France developed its own campaign through the work of Antoine-Augustin Parmentier. Parmentier was born in 1737 and trained as a pharmacist. During the 7 Years' War, he served with the French army and was captured by Prussian forces. Potatoes formed part of his diet during imprisonment. After returning to France, he became convinced that the crop could help reduce hunger. French attitudes were changing, although restrictions and doubts remained in some regions. Parmentier used scientific work and public persuasion to improve the potato's reputation. He studied its nutritional value and wrote about its use as human food. He presented potato-based dishes to influential guests and supported public demonstrations of cultivation. His efforts connected the crop with science, respectable dining, and national improvement. A meal built around potatoes could carry more social influence than a government order posted in a village. Parmentier also received support from prominent figures at the French court. Stories describe King Louis XVI wearing a potato flower and Marie Antoinette placing the blossoms in her hair. Some details became polished through later retelling. Yet Parmentier's public campaign was real and unusually effective. He helped move the potato away from its earlier association with livestock, hospitals, and emergency food. French rules that had discouraged potato growing were eased during the 18th century. Cultivation expanded further during periods of grain shortage and political disruption. The French Revolution began in 1789, and the years that followed placed enormous pressure on food supplies. Potatoes became increasingly useful because households could grow them in gardens and small fields without waiting for flour to pass through a mill. Parmentier's name remained attached to the crop long after his death in 1813. Hachis Parmentier, a French dish made with minced meat beneath a layer of mashed potato, still carries his name. Government orders and public campaigns accelerated adoption, though neither could create permanent acceptance on its own. Farmers watched how potatoes performed in their own soil. families learned whether the tubers stored well through winter. Cooks found ways to prepare them with familiar fats, herbs, milk, and meat. A successful harvest did more to build trust than any royal instruction. Market demand also mattered. As more people ate potatoes, farmers had stronger reasons to plant them. Seed tubers moved between villages, and practical knowledge traveled with them. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, potatoes had become ordinary food across large parts of northern and central Europe. Their spread had begun with experiments, decrees, and determined advocates. Its lasting force came from the meals a field could provide. Once millions of households began using that extra food, the potato started changing the number of people European land could support. As potatoes became common across Europe, their influence began to appear in population records. Europe held roughly 120 million people around the year 1700. By 1900, that number had risen beyond 400 million. No single crop produced that growth. Improved transportation moved food more reliably between regions. Trade brought new products into expanding markets. Sanitation and medicine became increasingly important during the 19th century. Maize and other crops from the Americas also added new sources of food. Potatoes contributed by allowing certain landscapes to feed more people than they had supported before. A dependable food supply affects a population slowly. Children who receive enough food are more likely to survive their early years. Adults, weakened by poor diets, become more vulnerable to infection. A failed harvest can delay marriages, break apart households, or force people to leave their homes. When harvests become more reliable, families gain a little more room to grow. The potato provided large amounts of carbohydrate, which the body can use for energy. It also supplied vitamin C and potassium. Vitamin C supports connective tissue, wound healing, and several functions of the immune system. Potassium helps nerves and muscles work while supporting the movement of fluid through the body. These nutrients mattered in diets that often depended heavily on bread or porridge. Potatoes combined especially well with milk or buttermilk. Milk added fat, calcium, and more protein. The two foods together supported people more effectively than potatoes alone. Economic historians have tried to measure how much this new crop changed the old world. Nathan Nunn and Nancy Chien studied the spread of potatoes across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Their research compared regions where local soil and climate were naturally suitable for potato farming, with regions where the crop grew poorly. They also examined what happened before and after potatoes became widely available from the early 18th century onward. Their analysis suggested that potato adoption may explain roughly 1/4 of the growth in population and urbanization across the Old World between 1700 and 1900. This remains an estimate built from historical records and statistical comparisons. It cannot separate every influence that acted on families over 2 centuries. The finding still gives a sense of the potato's possible scale. Extra food produced in rural areas could support people who were no longer growing all of their own grain. A mining settlement needed workers underground rather than behind plows. Textile towns required people to spin thread, operate looms, repair machinery, and move finished cloth. Soldiers stationed far from home depended on food supplied by farmers and merchants. Growing cities needed a steady flow of affordable meals for laborers, children, and older residents. Potatoes helped fill part of that demand close to where people lived. They could grow in household gardens, village plots, and fields near industrial towns. Families could boil them without paying a miller to grind grain. A poor harvest of wheat did not always destroy the potato crop growing in the same region. The two foods could spread agricultural risk when both remained available. Potatoes also released land for other uses in places where they produced more food from a small area. A household might grow tubers for its own meals, while selling grain, eggs, milk, or labor for income. This did not create industrialization by itself. Factories depended on machinery, coal, capital, trade networks, laws, and many other changes. A growing industrial society still needed enough food to keep a larger population alive. The potato became part of that support system. Its influence varied from one region to another. Some European communities continued relying mainly on rye, oats, or wheat. Others used potatoes as a seasonal addition to a mixed diet. A few societies moved much closer to dependence because poverty and land pressure left families with fewer alternatives. Ireland became the most important example. There, the potato's remarkable yield met a system of insecure tenancy, concentrated land ownership, and very small plots. The crop helped Ireland's population rise rapidly. It also became the thin layer of security beneath millions of people who had little money, little land, and almost no reserve when the harvest failed. Ireland's dependence on the potato grew inside a land system that left many families with very little room to recover from a bad year. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, most of the island remained under British rule. Large estates were often controlled by Protestant landlords. Some lived in Ireland, while others collected rent through agents and spent much of their time in Britain. Catholic tenant families usually worked land they did not own. A lease could be short, rent could rise, and eviction remained a constant risk. As families grew, rented holdings were often divided among sons. Each generation could receive a smaller piece of ground than the one before it. By the early 1800s, many rural households were trying to survive on only a few acres. Agricultural laborers faced an even narrower margin. Some relied on a system called conacha. Under conacha, a worker rented a small plot for a single growing season, commonly to plant potatoes. Payment might come from wages earned during the harvest or from labor performed for the landholder. The arrangement gave a family access to food-producing ground, yet it offered no long-term security. A missed payment or failed crop could remove both the harvest and the plot used to grow it. Potatoes fit this system unusually well. Ireland's cool summers and frequent rain supported steady leaf growth and tuber formation. A small field could produce far more edible weight than many grain crops grown on the same ground. The tubers could be planted with a spade, lifted by hand, and cooked without passing through a mill. For households short on land, cash, and equipment, those advantages were decisive. Ireland's population rose from roughly 3 million people in the early 18th century to more than 8 million in the census of 1841. The potato helped make that growth possible, though the crop did not create the poverty surrounding it. Land inequality, insecure tenancy, low wages, and limited access to other food kept many families dependent on the harvest beneath their own soil. Poor adults sometimes ate several kilograms of potatoes in a day. Historical estimates vary by region and household, but daily amounts of 3 to 5 kilograms were possible for laborers performing heavy physical work. The potatoes were often boiled in large pots and eaten with milk or buttermilk when the family could afford it. This diet supplied a great deal of carbohydrate for energy. Potatoes also provided vitamin C, potassium, and a modest amount of protein. Milk added fat, calcium, and more protein. Together, these foods could support life for long periods, even though the diet remained repetitive and reflected severe economic limits. Other foods were available across Ireland. Grain, butter, cattle, and pigs were produced on the island. Access depended on land, wages, rent, and market prices. A family might raise an animal or grow oats, while still relying on potatoes for most daily calories. Produce with greater market value could be sold to pay rent rather than kept for the household table. The variety known as the lumper became especially important among poorer growers. It produced heavy crops and could tolerate relatively poor ground. Its flavor and texture were considered less desirable than those of some other potatoes, but yield mattered more to a family trying to fill a cooking pot. Ireland also grew other varieties, so the country was never covered by one perfectly identical potato. The biological base was still becoming dangerously narrow in the districts where poor households depended heavily on susceptible types such as the lumper. A productive crop had allowed millions of people to live within a harsh economic structure. That success concealed how little reserve remained. Many families had no secure second field, no savings, and no reliable supply of replacement food. Their main harvest was also reproduced in a way that preserved the same inherited traits from one season to the next. Each year's potatoes were commonly grown from pieces of the previous year's tubers, creating fields filled with repeated copies of the same vulnerable plants. The tubers saved for planting carried more than stored starch. They also carried the inherited traits of the plants that produced them. Potato plants can reproduce in two different ways. After flowering, some plants form small green fruits containing true botanical seeds. Each seed is created through sexual reproduction, which mixes genetic material from two parent cells. Plants grown from those seeds differ from one another. Their tubers may vary in color, shape, maturity time, flavor, or resistance to disease. Farmers seeking a dependable crop usually use seed potatoes instead. A seed potato is a whole tuber, or a cut piece, containing at least one healthy eye. Once planted, its buds produce stems with almost the same genetic instructions as the original plant. This form of reproduction is called vegetative propagation. It creates a clone, meaning a new plant that is genetically very similar to its parent. Cloning offers valuable control. A farmer who finds a potato with a useful shape can reproduce that shape year after year. The same method preserves skin color, flesh texture, cooking quality, and the time required for the crop to mature. A variety that performs well in poor ground can be copied without waiting for the uncertain results of botanical seeds. Commercial growers still depend heavily on this system. A field planted with russet Burbank seed potatoes, for example, is expected to produce long tubers with the dry matter needed for baking and French fry processing. Factories require that consistency because cutting machines, cooking times, and quality standards are designed around predictable potatoes. The same reliability appeared in historical fields on a smaller scale. An Irish family could save part of a successful harvest and use those tubers to begin the following season. Neighbors exchanged planting stock, while markets and landlords helped certain varieties spread across wider areas. Each successful copy made the crop more familiar. The process also preserved hidden weaknesses. A disease that could infect one plant might find nearly the same biological defenses in every cloned plant around it. Thousands of separate stems could rise above the soil while sharing almost identical inherited responses. Genetic uniformity alone does not cause crop failure. Weather, soil, farming methods, and the pathogen itself still shape the outcome. Uniform fields become especially vulnerable when an organism arrives that can defeat the defenses shared by the dominant variety. Vegetative propagation can carry other problems forward as well. Plant viruses may survive inside an infected tuber. When that tuber is planted, the new shoots can begin life already carrying the virus. Repeated propagation may allow infection to build across several growing seasons. Symptoms can include curled leaves, mottled color, weak growth, and reduced yield. Modern seed potato systems were developed partly to control this problem. Specialized growers produce planting stock under inspection. Fields are checked for visible disease, and laboratory tests can detect certain viruses. Infected plants may be removed before harvest. Each generation of certified seed is tracked so growers know how many times the material has been multiplied. These systems reduce risk, although they cannot remove every pathogen from every tuber. The word monoculture is often used for agriculture based on one crop across a large area. It can also describe farming that relies on a narrow group of genetically similar varieties. Ireland before the famine contained more potato diversity than the simplest retellings suggest. Different districts grew several named varieties. Poor households still depended heavily on productive, susceptible potatoes, such as the lumper. That dependence created broad areas where the crop shared similar weaknesses. Earlier Andean farming had often distributed risk differently. Families maintained several land races and planted them across fields at different elevations. Variation in growth time and disease resistance made a completely uniform response less likely. Irish families facing high rents and tiny plots had fewer opportunities to preserve such a wide collection. Yield during the current season mattered more than protection against an unfamiliar future disease. For years, the cloned fields appeared healthy. Green leaves covered the ridges, while new tubers formed beneath them. The shared vulnerability remained invisible until cool rain and wet foliage created ideal conditions for a microscopic water mold arriving from across the Atlantic. The organism responsible for late blight is called Phytophthora infestans. Its scientific name roughly means plant destroyer. It belongs to a group called Umicites, often described as water molds. Umicites grow through plant tissue in branching threads that resemble fungal growth, although their evolutionary history places them in a separate group of organisms. That distinction was unknown to farmers in 1845. They could only see healthy green leaves developing dark patches after periods of cool rain. The spreading stage of Phytophthora infestans is often carried inside structures called sporangia. A sporangium is a microscopic container capable of producing new infection. Wind can lift these structures from infected plants and carry them into nearby fields. Rain splashes them between leaves or moves them down through the crop. Once a sporangium lands on a wet leaf, Moisture allows the infection process to begin. Under some conditions, it releases tiny mobile spores called zoospores. Each zoospore has slender tails that help it move through a film of water. It can travel only a very short distance, yet a wet leaf provides enough space to reach an opening or vulnerable area in the surface. The organism then sends fine growth into the leaf. It draws nutrients from living plant cells while expanding through the tissue. A small, water-soaked mark may darken into a brown or black lesion. The word lesion simply means an area of injured or diseased tissue. Under favorable conditions, the damaged area can enlarge within hours. During humid weather, pale growth may appear near the edge of the lesion on the underside of the leaf. This growth produces more sporangia, allowing the cycle to continue. A single infected plant can therefore become a source of material that spreads across a field. Stems may develop darkened patches as the organism advances. Once enough leaves are damaged, photosynthesis falls sharply. The plant can no longer send the same steady supply of sugars toward its developing tubers. Rain also washes infectious material from leaves into the soil. Sporangia carried downward may reach potatoes near the surface, especially when tubers are poorly covered or the soil develops cracks. The organism enters the tuber through small openings, damaged skin, or direct contact with infected tissue. Firm flesh develops irregular brown areas beneath the skin. Some tubers break down during storage. Others become vulnerable to bacteria and fungi that enter the damaged tissue and cause further decay. Weather controls the speed of this process. Late blight generally thrives when leaves remain wet for hours and temperatures stay cool to mild. Exact conditions vary among strains and stages of infection. A damp period near 15 degrees Celsius can support rapid spread, while dry air interrupts the films of water needed for new infection. Ireland's frequent rain, cloud cover, and mild summer temperatures created long periods of wet foliage. Closely planted susceptible potatoes gave each new generation of sporangia another suitable plant only a short distance away. Farmers lacked effective fungicides and laboratory testing, while weather warning systems did not yet exist. By the time dark patches became obvious, infection could already be scattered through neighboring plants. Modern science has examined preserved 19th century potato leaves to identify the lineage involved in the famine-era epidemic. Researchers recovered fragments of pathogen DNA from dried specimens kept in botanical collections. The lineage was named Herb 1. It dominated the historic outbreak before later populations of Phytophthora infestans became more common. The organism continues evolving today. New populations can carry combinations of genes that help them infect previously resistant potatoes. Some respond differently to fungicides, which can reduce the usefulness of treatments that once worked reliably. Farmers now combine resistant varieties with field inspection, weather forecasting, clean seed, crop rotation, and carefully timed sprays. Even with these controls, late blight causes losses and management costs worth billions of dollars around the world. The disease remains powerful because it can reproduce quickly, and because the potato crop often places many similar plants close together. The biology of Phytophthora infestans explains how green fields and sound tubers could be destroyed. The scale of human loss in Ireland grew from conditions beyond the plant itself, including poverty, access to food, land ownership, and the decisions made while the harvest was disappearing. Late blight reached several parts of Europe during the summer of 1845. In Ireland, dark lesions appeared across potato leaves as the harvest approached. When families dug into the soil, many tubers were already damaged. The loss was severe, although part of the crop survived. Some households sold animals, borrowed money, or relied on small reserves while hoping the following season would restore what had been lost. The harvest of 1846 removed much of that hope. Cool, wet weather helped Phytophthora infestans spread across the island. Fields that had supported families only a year earlier produced very little usable food. Seed potatoes saved for planting were eaten, sold, or destroyed by disease. This made recovery harder because a family without healthy seed tubers could not simply begin again the following spring. The crisis continued through several harvests. The period known as the Great Famine is usually dated from 1845 to 1852. Food loss was only the beginning. Families still owed rent. Workers who depended on seasonal farm labor lost income when crops failed. The price of replacement food rose as demand increased. People who had relied on potatoes for most of their daily energy often lacked enough money to buy grain in the market. Malnutrition weakened the body's defenses. Typhus and relapsing fever spread through crowded living conditions. Dysentery caused dangerous fluid loss. Many famine deaths resulted from disease acting on people already weakened by hunger. Government relief began under Prime Minister Robert Peel. His administration arranged the import of maize from the United States. In Ireland, this grain became widely known as Indian corn. It was unfamiliar to many families and required proper grinding before it could be cooked safely and easily. Peel's government also created relief committees and supported public works intended to provide wages. The political situation changed in 1846. Lord John Russell became Prime Minister, and his government placed greater trust in private markets and local relief. Officials feared that large government food programs would interfere with trade or create long-term dependence. Public works expanded, requiring weakened people to perform road building and other physical labor in return for wages. Those wages often failed to keep pace with rising food prices. Workhouses offered food and shelter under the Irish Poor Law. They had been designed to feel less desirable than life outside, with strict rules and limited comfort. As hunger spread, many workhouses became overcrowded. The cost of poor relief also fell heavily on local property taxes. The poorest western districts had the greatest need and the smallest tax base, leaving relief weakest where suffering was often most severe. A temporary soup kitchen system began operating widely in 1847. At its height, roughly 3 million people received food through these kitchens. The program provided direct meals more efficiently than the public works. It lasted only a few months before responsibility shifted back toward the workhouse system. Food continued leaving Ireland during the famine. The island still produced grain, livestock, butter, and other agricultural goods. Some exports declined, while others continued through existing contracts and market networks. Their presence did not mean enough food was freely available to hungry families. Access depended on wages, ownership, prices, and government policy. The sight of valuable food moving through ports, while nearby communities went hungry, became one of the famine's most lasting sources of anger. Evictions increased as tenants fell behind on rent. Some landlords provided assistance or paid for emigration. Others cleared families from land that was being reorganized for larger farms or livestock. Displacement pushed people toward towns, workhouses, roads, and ports. By 1851, Ireland's population had fallen to about 6.6 million, down from approximately 8.2 million in 1841. Roughly 1 million people died from hunger and related disease. Around another million emigrated during the Central Famine years, with many more leaving during the decades that followed. Late blight triggered the crop failures. Poverty, insecure landholding, limited relief, and political choices shaped their human cost. The potato had supported an enormous population on very little land, while the surrounding system offered almost no protection when that food disappeared. Empty homes and abandoned fields remained across Ireland. The people who left carried the consequences into Britain, Canada, the United States, and cities far beyond the island. Irish families had been leaving the island long before the famine began. Seasonal workers travelled to Britain, while other emigrants crossed the Atlantic in search of wages and land. After 1845, the movement grew much larger. Emigration became an escape from hunger and eviction, as well as a way to protect relatives who remained behind. The closest destinations were British cities such as Liverpool and Glasgow. A passage across the Irish Sea was shorter and cheaper than an Atlantic voyage. Liverpool became both a permanent home for Irish families and a transfer point for ships leaving Britain. Many people continued toward British North America. Sailing vessels carried passengers to Quebec, where newcomers entered the St. Lawrence River and traveled inland toward Montreal, Toronto, or rural settlements. Before reaching Quebec City, arriving ships stopped at Grosse Ile. This small island served as a quarantine station where officials inspected passengers for infectious disease. In 1847, one of the famine's worst migration years, nearly 100,000 immigrants passed through the station. Typhus spread easily aboard crowded vessels and later among patients on the island. Ships carrying famine emigrants became known as coffin ships when poor ventilation, inadequate food, contaminated water, and illness caused unusually high death rates. Conditions differed between vessels. Some captains maintained cleaner quarters and better provisions, while others carried too many passengers into spaces designed mainly for cargo. Government rules gradually became stricter, though enforcement remained uneven during the crisis. Famine migrants often arrived with fewer resources than earlier Irish settlers. Many had spent nearly everything on passage. A person reaching Quebec, Boston, or New York might own little beyond clothing and a few household objects. Employment became urgent from the first days ashore. Irish workers entered construction, domestic service, dock labour, canal digging, and factory work. In Canada, Irish labour helped build canals, railways, roads, and expanding city neighbourhoods. In the United States, large communities formed in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Housing near docks or factories was often crowded because rents were lower and work was close. Anti-Irish prejudice shaped these early years. Many newcomers were Catholic in societies where Protestant majorities sometimes viewed them with suspicion. Employers could offer lower wages because recently arrived workers had few alternatives. Political movements warned that Irish immigration threatened local culture or elections. Signs and newspaper advertisements sometimes discouraged Irish applicants. Support also grew inside the communities themselves. Parishes raised money for families in need and helped new arrivals find familiar faces. Mutual aid societies provided assistance during illness or unemployment. Neighborhood businesses offered work, credit, and information in places where accents or religion could create barriers elsewhere. Labor unions gained members among Irish workers, while political organizations learned that concentrated immigrant neighborhoods could become powerful voting communities. Migration soon developed its own momentum. An emigrant who found steady work could send money home. A letter might describe wages, travel routes, housing, or the name of a trustworthy contact near the port. Some people purchased prepaid tickets for relatives. These tickets reduced the largest financial barrier to migration and allowed parents, siblings, or neighbors to follow. This process is called chain migration. Each settled person creates a small network that makes later movement easier. One household might become several households living within the same city. Over time, those networks connected particular Irish counties with particular streets, parishes, and workplaces across the Atlantic. Irish settlement changed urban life in Canada and the United States. New workers entered growing industries. Catholic churches and schools expanded. Irish political groups became influential in municipal elections, especially where immigrants formed a large share of the population. Memories of British rule and the famine also strengthened support for Irish nationalism abroad. The diaspora carried familiar songs, religious customs, family stories, and foods into new homes. Potatoes remained present in dishes that could be prepared cheaply and shared across a household. Their meaning now included the memory of the crop's failure, as well as the comfort of everyday meals. The famine scattered Irish communities across the Atlantic world, yet it did not stop the potato's wider journey. Across Asia, Africa, and other parts of Europe, farmers were adopting the same crop under different climates and fitting it into entirely different cooking traditions. The potato continued moving through trade routes, colonial networks, missionary gardens, military supply systems, and family migration. Each new region tested the crop under different soils, seasons, and cooking traditions. In China, potatoes were present by the 17th century. They became especially useful in mountainous areas, where steep slopes, cool temperatures, and limited water made flooded rice farming difficult. Farmers in provinces such as Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou could grow potatoes at elevations where rice produced unreliable harvests. By the 21st century, China had become the world's largest potato producer. India became the second largest. Portuguese traders probably brought potatoes to parts of the Indian coast during the 17th century. Cultivation later expanded under British rule, especially in cooler highland districts and northern farming regions. Indian cooks folded the potato into food systems already shaped by lentils, rice, flatbreads, spice mixtures, and vegetable curries. The Hindi word aloo became part of the names of many familiar dishes. Aloo gobi combines potatoes with cauliflower and spices such as turmeric, cumin, and coriander. Samosas often hold a filling of crushed potato, peas, and seasoning inside fried pastry. Potatoes also became important across the highlands of eastern Africa. Farmers in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, and neighboring countries found that the crop performed well in cool upland climates. A potato can mature within a few months, allowing it to fit between other seasonal crops or provide food during a gap in grain supplies. Its underground tubers also offer a concentrated harvest from small fields near growing towns. Local adoption changed the potato's identity each time it entered a new kitchen. In the Andes, causa is made from seasoned mashed yellow potato, often layered with vegetables, fish, chicken, or avocado. Papa a la huancaína covers boiled potatoes with a creamy sauce traditionally flavored with yellow ají peppers and fresh cheese. Irish colcannon mixes mashed potatoes with cabbage or kale, while boxty uses grated or mashed potato in cakes or pancakes. Across Poland, pierogi can be filled with potato and cheese. Ukrainian vareniki may hold a similar filling before being boiled and served with onions or sour cream. Swiss rösti begins with grated potato, pressed into a broad cake and cooked until the outside becomes crisp. Latkes use grated potato with onion and a binding ingredient before frying. Spanish tortilla combines sliced potatoes with eggs, creating a thick dish cooked slowly in a pan. Italian gnocchi uses cooked potato mixed with flour to form soft pieces of dough. In Canada, poutine places cheese curds and gravy over fried potatoes. British chips use thicker cuts, commonly served with fried fish. These foods developed in different climates and religious traditions, yet the potato adapted easily because its flavor remains mild and its internal structure contains abundant starch. Boiled potato can thicken soup as its cells soften and release starch. Mashed potato can bind fillings or provide the body of a dough. Grated potato can form a crisp surface when moisture escapes during frying. A cut tuber absorbs salt, spices, animal fat, vegetable oil, or sauce, while still keeping its own recognizable texture. Drying and fermentation provide further possibilities. Andean chuño can remain stored for years before being rehydrated. Some European traditions fermented potato mixtures or used potato starch in breads and dumplings when grain flour was scarce. The origins of several famous potato foods remain disputed. Belgium and France both have strong historical claims connected with the development of French fries. The popular story that potato chips were invented in 1853 by a cook in Saratoga Springs may preserve part of their history, although thin fried potato slices existed in earlier cookbooks. Foods rarely appear in one perfect moment. They usually develop through repeated experiments in homes, inns, street stalls, and commercial kitchens. The potato's worldwide success came partly from this ability to enter an existing meal without demanding that the entire cuisine change around it. Its texture could be soft, dense, chewy, or crisp, depending on variety and preparation. Those results begin before the potato reaches the kitchen. A tuber chosen for dry, fluffy mash carries a different balance of water and starch from one expected to remain firm in a salad or stew. The varieties selected for long, pale French fries have still another internal structure, shaped for a very specific transformation under heat. A cook choosing potatoes is already choosing a texture before the pan becomes warm. The familiar terms floury and waxy describe how different tubers behave during cooking. Floury potatoes tend to become dry, light, and soft inside. Waxy potatoes usually remain denser and keep their shape more easily after boiling. Much of this difference begins with dry matter. Dry matter is everything left in a potato after its water has been removed. It includes starch, protein, fiber, minerals, and small amounts of sugar. Fresh potatoes are mostly water, although the exact proportion varies by variety and growing conditions. A high dry matter potato contains less water and usually more starch in each gram of flesh. When baked, its cells separate readily and create a fluffy interior. During well-controlled frying, less internal water also means the potato can absorb less oil than a low dry matter tuber cooked under the same conditions. Lower dry matter potatoes contain more moisture. Their cooked cells often remain packed together more firmly. This makes many of them useful for potato salads, soups, and roasted dishes where the pieces need to hold their shape. The structure of the starch also matters. Potato starch is made mainly from two large molecules called amylose and amylopectin. Both are built from glucose, a simple sugar produced by plants. Amylose molecules form mostly long, straighter chains. Amylopectin has many branches extending from its main structure. Amylopectin usually makes up the larger share of potato starch. The ratio between these molecules affects how starch absorbs water, thickens, and firms again after cooling. Texture still depends on more than that ratio. The strength of the cell walls, the amount of water between cells, and the total concentration of starch all influence what happens in a cooking pot. Russet Burbank offers a familiar example of a high dry matter potato. The variety was developed from an earlier potato created by American plant breeder Luther Burbank during the 19th century. A mutation later produced the rough brown skin associated with the modern Russet Burbank. Its long shape and flowery interior made it widely used for baking and French fry production in North America. A large tuber can produce more long, even strips, which is valuable to restaurants and frozen food factories. Yukon Gold behaves differently. This yellow flesh variety was released in Canada in 1980. It has a moderately moist texture that sits between many floury russets and firmer waxy potatoes. Its yellow color comes partly from carotenoid pigments. Yukon Gold can be mashed, boiled, or roasted without behaving exactly like either extreme. Red-skinned potatoes and many fingerling varieties are often selected for boiling or roasting. Their flesh commonly remains firm enough to survive stirring and serving. Individual varieties still vary, so skin color alone cannot predict cooking behavior with complete accuracy. Farmers and processors measure potatoes more carefully. One common measurement is specific gravity. Specific gravity compares the density of a potato with the density of water. A higher reading usually suggests more dry matter and starch. Processors may also examine tuber length, overall size, internal discoloration, bruising, hollow areas, sugar concentration, and color after frying. Sugar is especially important. Potatoes containing too much glucose or fructose may brown very quickly in hot oil. The finished fries or chips can become darker than customers expect. Growing conditions can alter these qualities even within one name variety. Water supply affects tuber size and dry matter. An early harvest may produce potatoes with different chemistry from fully mature ones. Storage temperature can convert some starch into sugar, especially when tubers are held too cold. Two sacks carrying the same variety name may therefore cook somewhat differently after separate growing seasons or storage histories. Commercial breeding narrows the acceptable range even further. A French fry company may need long potatoes with high dry matter, pale flesh, low sugar, and few internal defects. A chip manufacturer may prefer rounder tubers that produce even slices. Fresh market growers consider appearance, storage life, flavor, and resistance to bruising alongside cooking quality. These demands explain why only a small number of varieties may dominate a large industry even though thousands of potatoes exist. The result on a dinner plate begins with inherited plant traits, field conditions, harvest timing, and months of storage. Heat then acts on that starting material. Water shifts, starch granules swell, cell walls weaken, and the surface begins to brown. Those changes decide whether the finished potato holds together, falls into soft flakes, becomes sticky under a masher, or develops a crisp shell around a tender center. As a potato warms, the water already held inside its cells begins moving more quickly. Around 58 to 66 degrees Celsius, many of its starch granules start to gelatinize. Gelatinization is the process in which starch absorbs water, swells, and loses part of its tightly ordered structure. The exact temperature varies with the potato variety, growing conditions, and amount of water available. Each swollen granule occupies more space than it did when raw. At the same time, heat begins weakening the material that holds neighboring plant cells together. One important part of that material is pectin. Pectin is a group of complex carbohydrates found in plant cell walls and in the layer between adjacent cells. It helps the cells remain joined while the potato is growing. During cooking, changes in pectin allow those cells to loosen. A floury potato often separates into individual cooked cells quite easily. The tongue experiences those separated cells as a dry, soft, or fluffy texture. A waxier potato tends to keep more of its cellular structure intact, so a boiled slice can remain firm enough to lift with a fork. Boiling surrounds the potato with water near 100 degrees Celsius. Heat moves inward from the surface while water enters some damaged areas and carries away dissolved compounds. The starch swells inside the cells, and the tissue gradually softens. Small cubes cook more quickly than whole potatoes because heat has a shorter distance to travel. A whole medium potato may need 20 to 30 minutes of boiling, while small pieces can soften in less than half that time. Baking creates a different movement of moisture. An oven may be set near 200 degrees Celsius, although the center of the potato remains much cooler because it contains so much water. Water inside the tuber turns to steam and moves outward. The skin dries while the interior becomes soft. In a high dry matter russet, the cooked cells separate readily, creating the loose texture associated with a baked potato. Mashing changes the structure again. Gentle crushing separates many softened cells while leaving much of their starch enclosed. A ricer or hand masher can therefore produce a light result. Fast blending breaks far more cells open. Large amounts of gelatinized starch escape into the surrounding moisture. The released starch molecules tangle and hold water, creating the heavy, sticky texture sometimes called gluey mashed potatoes. Frying begins with rapid evaporation at the surface. When a potato enters oil commonly heated between about 175 and 190 degrees Celsius, surface water quickly becomes steam. The escaping moisture leaves small spaces behind and helps create a dry outer layer. Some oil enters those spaces as the food cools or when steam pressure falls. Inside the piece, the temperature remains closer to the boiling point of water until much of the moisture has moved away. This allows a fry to develop a crisp shell around a softer center. Browning occurs most strongly where the surface has become dry and hot. One major process is the Maillard reaction. This reaction involves reducing sugars, such as glucose, interacting with amino compounds from proteins. It produces many new molecules responsible for roasted aromas, deeper flavor, and golden brown color. Potatoes stored at very low temperatures may accumulate extra sugars. Those tubers can brown too quickly during frying and may develop a darker, more bitter surface. High-temperature cooking can also produce acrylamide. Acrylamide forms in some starch-rich foods when certain sugars react with the amino acid asparagine. Frying, roasting, and baking can create more of it than boiling, because their surfaces reach much higher temperatures. Cooking changes continue after the potato leaves the pan or oven. As gelatinized starch cools, portions of the molecules begin lining up again. This process is called retrogradation. Amylose chains realign relatively quickly, while changes in amylopectin develop more slowly. Part of the reorganized starch becomes resistant starch. Resistant starch passes through the small intestine with less digestion than ordinary cooked starch and reaches the large intestine, where gut bacteria can use some of it. Cooling cooked potatoes for several hours can increase this resistant fraction. Reheating them later may leave part of that change in place. Texture, browning, digestion, and aroma all grow from the same hidden materials, responding to water and temperature. The potato on the plate carries the combined effects of its variety, its storage history, and every degree of heat applied during cooking. Once the cooked potato is eaten, its starch, water, vitamins, minerals, and plant chemicals enter a different set of processes. A fresh potato is usually about 75 to 80% water. Most of what remains is carbohydrate, and most of that carbohydrate is starch. The tuber also contains smaller amounts of protein, fiber, vitamins, minerals, and natural defensive compounds. Vitamin C is one of its better-known nutrients. The amount varies with variety, storage time, and cooking method, because vitamin C slowly breaks down with age and heat. Potatoes also provide potassium, a mineral used by nerves and muscles, along with vitamin B6, which helps the body process proteins and carbohydrates. Their protein content is modest, yet the balance of amino acids is useful compared with that of several other plant staples. A potato-only diet would still leave important nutritional gaps. Historically, milk or buttermilk added fat, calcium, and extra protein to potato-heavy diets. Fiber is often associated with the skin, although the rest of the tuber also contains nutrients. Peeling removes some fiber and a portion of the compounds found close to the surface. The inner flesh still supplies vitamin C, potassium, starch, and other nutrients. Cooking changes how much of those materials remain in the meal. Boiling can move water-soluble nutrients into the cooking water. Potatoes simmered whole with their skins generally lose less than small peeled pieces because less surface area is exposed. A soup or stew may retain some of what leaves the potato because the cooking liquid is eaten. Frying creates a very different food. As surface water escapes, oil enters parts of the tissue. The finished portion becomes more energy dense because it contains less water and more fat. Butter, cream, cheese, salt, gravy, and frying oil also change the final meal. These additions supply their own nutrients and calories. Digestion depends on the potato's variety and physical condition. A hot, freshly mashed floury potato may release starch quickly because cooking has swollen the granules and broken much of the tissue apart. This can produce a faster rise in blood glucose, the sugar carried through the bloodstream. That rise is called the glycemic response. A firm potato served with protein, fat, fiber, or other vegetables may be digested more slowly. Portion size matters as well, and individual bodies do not respond in exactly the same way. Cooling adds another change. Some gelatinized starch realigns as the potato rests in a refrigerator. Part of it becomes resistant starch, which avoids digestion in the small intestine more successfully than ordinary cooked starch. It then reaches the large intestine, where some gut bacteria can use it. Reheating the potato may reduce part of this effect, although a portion of the resistant starch can remain. The same tuber also carries chemicals designed to protect the plant. Solanine and chaconine are the main glycoalkaloids discussed in food potatoes. They are concentrated more strongly in sprouts, damaged areas, skin exposed to light, and the plant's leaves and fruits. Light exposure often turns a potato green because chlorophyll develops near the surface. Chlorophyll creates the green color. The safety concern comes from the possibility that glycoalkaloid levels have increased at the same time. Health Canada uses 200 milligrams per kilogram, equal to 200 parts per million, as the maximum total glycoalkaloid level for potato tubers. Ordinary sound potatoes generally remain well below that limit. Strong bitterness, extensive green areas, heavy sprouting, or major damage are signs that a tuber should be treated cautiously. Small sprouts or limited green skin can sometimes be removed deeply, while widespread changes make discarding the potato the safer choice. Storage therefore affects far more than appearance. Light alters color and defensive chemistry, while cold can convert starch into sugars. Warm conditions speed aging and sprouting, and bruises create openings for decay. Managing those changes inside one kitchen is fairly simple. Managing them across a warehouse holding thousands of tons requires controlled air, temperature, humidity, inspection, and careful handling from harvest to processing. An industrial potato harvest remains alive from the moment it leaves the field. Its cells continue respiring. Its buds remain capable of growth, and every bruise can become an entry point for decay. The system begins months earlier with certified seed potatoes. Certification programs inspect planting stock for varietal identity, physical quality, and signs of disease. Fields may be examined during growth, while laboratory tests can detect viruses that are difficult to recognize by sight. Whole seed potatoes are often used when the tubers are small. Larger ones may be cut into pieces, provided that each piece carries at least one viable eye. Mechanical planters place the pieces at regular depths and spacing. As shoots emerge, growers draw soil around the base of each plant in a process called hilling. The raised ridge gives stolons loose soil in which to expand. It also shields developing tubers from sunlight, reducing greening and the associated rise in glycoalkaloids. Water must be supplied carefully while the tubers enlarge. Some farms depend mainly on rainfall. Others use center pivot systems, which carry irrigation pipes around a central point and create circular fields. Too little water limits tuber growth. Uneven moisture can contribute to misshapen potatoes or growth cracks. Pest management may include crop rotation, field scouting, resistant varieties, and carefully timed treatments. Near the end of the season, growers allow the crop to mature. The vines may die naturally or be removed so the tuber skin can strengthen before harvest. Mechanical harvesters move beneath the ridges and raise soil, stones, vines, and potatoes onto moving belts. Shaking webs and rollers remove much of the soil before the tubers pass into a truck. Every transfer must be controlled. A short fall can bruise internal tissue, especially when potatoes are cold. Sharp edges may cut the skin, while the weight of a deep pile can create pressure damage near the bottom. Freshly harvested potatoes often pass through a curing period. Under controlled warmth and high humidity, cells around small wounds produce cork-like tissue that seals the damaged surface. Curing may last around 1 to 2 weeks. The temperature is then lowered gradually for longer storage. Inside a commercial potato building, ventilation ducts push air through a pile that may contain thousands of tons. Sensors track temperature and humidity. Fans remove heat released by respiration and prevent pockets of stale air from forming. Carbon dioxide must also be managed because every living tuber continues using oxygen and releasing this gas. Storage conditions depend on the market. Seed potatoes are kept cool enough to slow sprouting, while preserving their ability to grow later. Fresh market potatoes require protection from shriveling and decay. Processing potatoes are often stored at warmer temperatures because excessive cold can trigger cold-induced sweetening. During this process, starch is converted into reducing sugars such as glucose and fructose. Those sugars cause fries or chips to darken rapidly in hot oil and can increase acrylamide formation. Before processing, samples may be tested for sugar concentration, specific gravity, and color after frying. Factories also inspect length, size, internal defects, and damage. Long, uniform tubers are valuable for French fries because each potato yields more full-length strips. Round varieties may suit chip production more efficiently. Other potatoes are cooked and dried into flakes or granules used for instant mash and manufactured foods. Starch can be separated from crushed tubers and added to sauces or baked goods. Outside the kitchen, potato starch appears in paper coatings, textile finishing, and some adhesives. Damaged or undersized potatoes may become animal feed or fermentation feedstock. A smaller amount enters distilled spirits, although most modern vodka is made from grain or other fermentable materials. The ordinary potato reaching a home or restaurant carries the work of seed inspectors, field machinery, storage engineers, drivers, and quality laboratories. Each part of that system controls the metabolism of a living stem until cooking finally ends its ability to grow. Even the best controlled warehouse cannot hold biology still forever. A dependable variety must continue facing new strains of disease, shifting insect ranges, and climates that alter the conditions under which the crop was originally selected. Late blight remains one of the potato's most serious diseases. Phytophthora infestans continues reproducing, spreading, and evolving wherever potatoes are grown under favorable conditions. A variety carrying one useful resistance gene may perform well for years. That protection can weaken when pathogen populations develop a way around the plant's defense. Breeders therefore search for resistance that lasts across more strains and environments. Several resistance genes can sometimes be combined within one variety. Other approaches strengthen different parts of the plant's immune response or reduce the time leaves remain wet. Crop rotation, clean seed potatoes, field inspection, forecasting, and carefully timed treatments remain important alongside inherited resistance. This combined approach is often called integrated disease management. Its purpose is to slow infection through several overlapping forms of protection. Many useful traits already exist within the wider potato family. Wild potato species grow from the southwestern United States through Mexico and Central America into South America. Their tubers may be small, bitter, or poorly suited to modern processing. Their genes can still carry valuable responses to late blight, insects, frost, heat, and drought. Cultivated Andean landraces provide another broad source of variation. A variety maintained for generations on a cold Peruvian slope may contain traits absent from potatoes selected for uniform French fries. The International Potato Center in Peru maintains more than 7,000 cultivated, wild, and improved potato accessions. Each accession represents a distinct sample preserved for study or future breeding. Living shoots can be kept in tissue culture, where small pieces of plant grow inside sterile containers supplied with nutrients. True botanical seeds can remain stored under cold, dry conditions. Field collections allow plants to complete their normal growth cycle outdoors. Cryopreservation places tiny pieces of living tissue in liquid nitrogen near -196 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, biological activity becomes extremely slow, allowing valuable material to remain stable for long periods. Gene banks protect diversity from local loss. Continued farming gives that diversity a different kind of protection. When Andean families plant named varieties, they maintain the practical knowledge attached to each one. Planting dates, cooking methods, soil preferences, and responses to frost remain part of the living crop. The plants also continue encountering real weather, pests, and farmer selection. Modern breeding tries to combine this inherited variation with the qualities expected by growers, processors, and cooks. The work is difficult because many cultivated potatoes have 4 copies of each chromosome, rather than the 2 copies found in humans. A useful gene can therefore appear in several different combinations across the same plant. Breeders may need many crosses and years of field testing before yield, shape, flavor, storage life, and resistance appear together reliably. Marker-assisted breeding helps by tracking sections of DNA linked with useful traits. Markers are recognizable genetic patterns that allow researchers to identify promising seedlings before every trait becomes visible in the field. Genomic tools can examine much larger portions of the plant's inherited material. Gene editing may make a targeted change within potato DNA. Genetic engineering can introduce or combine genes through laboratory methods. Rules governing these crops differ between countries, and public acceptance varies with the method, trait, and intended use. Future potatoes may need to perform under hotter summers, irregular rainfall, changing insect ranges, and new pathogen populations. They will still be judged by familiar demands. Farmers need dependable yields. Consumers expect good flavor and nutrition. Storage operators require slow sprouting and manageable sugar levels. Factories need tubers with suitable size, dry matter, and cooking color. Fitting all of these qualities into one variety remains an ongoing compromise. Potato research has even extended beyond Earth. During the STS-73 mission aboard Space Shuttle Columbia in October of 1995, small potato tubers developed in orbit through research involving NASA and the University of Wisconsin. The experiment examined how plants form storage organs under microgravity. It provided useful biological observations, rather than an established food system for Mars or long-term space settlements. The potato's future will be shaped mainly in fields, laboratories, storage buildings, markets, and kitchens here on Earth. Its resilience will never remain finished. Each generation must preserve useful variation, observe new threats, and build better combinations from what earlier farmers protected. An ordinary potato resting beneath loose soil still carries that entire history. Its eyes contain dormant shoots. Its flesh stores starch gathered from sunlight. Its ancestry reaches back through modern breeding programs, migrating families, European fields, and thousands of years of Andean cultivation. The potato became important because it was productive, adaptable, and easy to transform. It remained dependable when people preserved the diversity and knowledge surrounding it. Inside one quiet underground stem are the strengths people learned to cultivate, the weaknesses history revealed, and the stored energy of another season waiting to begin.